This episode describes the battle that took place between the Traitor Legions commanded by Warmaster Horus and the Loyalist Legions of the Emperor of Mankind during the Horus Heresy event in Warhammer 40,000 universe. The Traitor Legions that invaded Earth that day were Iron Warriors of Primarch Perturabo, World Eaters of Primarch Angron, Death Guard of Primarch Mortarion, Thousand Sons of Primarch Magnus, and the Sons of Horus and Emperor's children under command of Traitor Warmaster Horus. The Loyalist legions that defended Earth were Imperial Fists of Primarch Rogaldorm, White Scars of Primarch Jagahtai Kahn, Blood Angels of Primarch Sanguinius, and the Adeptus Custodes headed by the Emperor of Mankind. The following narrates the incidents from the Battle of Terra in details.
On Mars, as across the entire vast Imperium, bitter civil war raged. On countless worlds, blood-mad warriors clashed. Some had pledged loyalty to the Emperor, others had sworn fealty to the Warmaster Horus, and through him to the dark powers of chaos. The Emperor's realm was in turmoil, and some of the greatest battles in human history were being fought. On the hive world of Thranx, over 1 million warriors died in a single day on the killing fields of Padagor. On the blazing deserts of Talan, at the Kahn salient, 50,000 tanks clashed in the greatest armoured action of all time. During the space drop on Vanaheim, 3 hive cities were depopulated by rebel forces as a warning against resistance, and still the defenders fought to the last man. Like a cancer, the heresy infected the entire structure of the Imperium. Everywhere brave men gave up their lives to try and excise that cancer. It was on Earth, at the very heart of humanity's realm, that the fate of the galaxy was to be decided. On the 13th day of Secundus, 30014, the bombardment began. From orbit, the Warmaster's ships laid down an unrelenting barrage of missiles and deadly energy beams. The aim was to cripple the defenses around the Emperor's palace and make possible a massive invasion of Earth. The lunar bases had already fallen, and the defending fleets had been scattered.
Despite the odds against them, Horus and his forces advanced towards Terra, determined to crush the Loyalists and claim victory for the forces of chaos. They encountered fierce resistance along the way, as the Loyalist forces fought desperately to defend their home planet. Horus, having already taken control of the Sol system, had deployed his massive fleet in orbit around Terra, from where he launched a devastating bombardment. The bombardment was meant to weaken the defenses of the planet, and pave the way for a ground assault that would see the traitor forces take the Imperial Palace and the seat of the Emperor himself. The first shell fired by the traitor fleet targeted the Sanctum Imperialis, the personal quarters of the Emperor. The shell, fired for symbolic reasons, did no damage to the palace and was quickly intercepted by Terra's sophisticated anti-ship gun batteries. The Loyalist defenders of Terra, comprising the Imperial Army, the Space Marines, and various other factions, immediately responded to the attack and opened fire on the traitor fleet. The exchange of fire between the two sides was vicious and intense, with both sides suffering heavy losses. However, the sheer weight of numbers of the traitor fleet allowed them to endure the barrage and continue their assault.
In those last days, the sky was black with dust clouds and the earth was split by gigantic fissures. Tectonic plates shifted under the stress of the bombardment. Mountain chains shivered and seas evaporated and became salty deserts. Rains of blood and ash dripped from the dark sky. Everywhere, oracles muttered evil portents, and men went mad with fear. Hideously twisted ships, full of the lost and the damned, hung in orbit over the ravaged world, shielded from the devastation by the cunningly wrought defenses of the Adeptus Mechanicus. The Emperor himself oversaw the defense of his fortress palace, personally commanding the Adeptus Custodes, his elite guard. He was accompanied by Sanguinius, white-pinioned Primarch of the Blood Angels, and his chapter of Space Marines. In the palace grounds stood the stalwart Adeptus Arbites. The palace was not the only bastion of resistance. There were others, each an awesome fortified city filled with dauntless soldiers. Beneath their fortress monastery, grim-visaged Rogel Dawn led the stern Imperial fists in final prayers. Within the armoured factory complexes of the Adeptus Mechanicus, tech priests preside their tools and girded on the fearsome weapons of their order. In the rubble of burned-out hab areas, Primarch Jagahtai Kahn mustered the White Scars, the chapter of Space Marines he had personally instructed in the art of lightning warfare. 3 full Titan legions stood ready to defend their Emperor. As the earth shuddered under the bombardment, tank divisions roared across the tortured landscape to take up their positions against the coming invasion. Brave men checked their weapons and offered up last prayers. Defense lasers swiveled to face the turbulent, threatening sky. Suddenly, the night was streaked by the plasma contrails of drop pods. Within the Emperor's halls, even the Space Marines shuddered, knowing that they would soon confront their lost and damned brethren. The terrifying prospect of facing those corrupt Primarchs who had sold their souls to chaos filled every man's mind with indescribable horror and dread. The pods touched ground, and from them erupted the mightiest champions of chaos, the renegade Space Marines of the Lost Chapters. These were no longer the fine human warriors of legend, but twisted creatures, bodies warped by the energies of chaos, minds twisted by their devotion to the dark powers. If what had happened to the Space Marines was bad, then what had happened to the Primarchs was worse. They had been created higher in the Emperor's esteem, and had fallen further. None of their former comrades would have recognized them. They had been transformed into creatures both demonic and exultant. Mighty Angron bellowed orders to his blood-drinking followers, the World Eaters. Brandishing his great rune sword, he led them against the defenders of Eternity Wall Spaceport. Around his red-armored followers, bolter shots whined. Unflinchingly they advanced, determined to spill blood for the Blood God. At Mortarion's soft-spoken command, the Death Guard emerged silently from the festering cocoons of their drop pods and advanced on their terror-stricken foes. The dread runes on Mortarion's scythe glittered eerily in the night as he gestured for them to advance. Magnus the Red glared triumphantly about him with his one watchful eye before ordering the mage warriors of the Thousand Suns to cast their spells of doom. A hail of deadly bolter shells cut down dozens of the Emperor's children. Undeterred, the wounded howled with pleasure at the experience and chanted praise of their Primarch Vulkan. The renegade Space Marines surged forward to carve a path through their foes.
Horus' ultimate objective was the Imperial Palace, and he was determined to capture it at any cost. As the bombardment continued, Perturabo, the Primarch of the Iron Warriors, probed for weaknesses in the Aegis and eventually discovered a flaw around Bastion 16. The Aegis in this area was weakened enough to allow slow-moving aircraft to penetrate. Despite the impatience of Angron and the boredom of Fulgrim, Horus would not launch an all-out attack yet, knowing that the Emperor's might prevented diamonds from manifesting on Terra, and also threatened to destroy the demon Primarchs should they set foot upon its soil. Meanwhile, Magnus and Zardulayak surmised a ritual to eliminate the Emperor's barrier by spilling enough blood across Terra. Horus began to spend more time comatose, his spirit inside the warp searching for lore and weakening the Emperor's spirit. Eventually, Horus designated First Captain Ezekiel Abaddon as his proxy. After 12 days of bombardment, the traitor forces launched their first ground assaults, with thousands of vessels crashing into Terra's surface. Many were destroyed by the palace defenses, but many more landed and unleashed endless hordes of traitors, including the Imperial army, beastmen, cultists, and mutants. These attacks were largely distractionary measures to support the traitors' true objectives as they ravaged the planet, and supported the traitor aerial attacks on the palace's anti-ship guns and void shield generators. The Loyalists responded with their own aerial defenses, and massive dogfights erupted over the palace as the conscripts in the outermost trenches around the walls held against the attacks by the Lost and the Damned. While the palace held, major population centers across Terra fell, such as London, Noe Zealand Hive, Neark, and Braslia. As the weeks wore on, the Death Guard fleet under the now corrupted Mortarion arrived at Terra. Horus had promised to let Mortarion's legion be the first to set foot upon Terra, and he prepared to use the Death Guard in the first Astartes-led assaults on the palace. This caused Angron to rage, and he was teleported by World Eater's 8th Company Captain Kahn into the ever-shifting labyrinth originally built for Vulkan, aboard the Night Lord's flagship Nightfall to prevent him from destroying his own flagship, the Conqueror. On the 7th of Quartus, the first Death Guard drop pods landed on Terra's soil as the 9 disciples of Kelbahal each beached one of their Arch Mechanicus class battleships around the palace. The void shields and bulk of the Arch Mechanicus vessels allowed the traitors to establish their first real footholds around the palace. As the Death Guard unleashed gas and plagues upon the trenches around the walls, the Dark Mechanicum set about their work of constructing siege engines. Meanwhile, aboard the Vengeful Spirit, Horus had finally allowed Perturabo to begin his preparations to clear landing zones around the palace for their Titans. The Iron Warriors started to construct landing zones and fortifications while the World Eaters, under the leadership of Kahn, continued to ravage the Imperial defenders. As the days passed, the traitors continued their assaults, but the Imperial defenders were able to hold their ground. The defenders were bolstered by the arrival of reinforcements from other Loyalist Space Marine legions, including the Ultramarines and the Blood Angels. The arrival of these reinforcements gave the defenders a much-needed boost in morale and firepower. Horus had managed to capture 2 of the key spaceports, the LionsGate and Eternity Wall, which had allowed him to land his last and greatest reserves, the Legio Mortis Titan Legion. The traitor forces were now at the gates of the Imperial Palace, the stronghold that housed the Emperor and the last defenders of the Imperium. The Loyalist forces were outnumbered and outgunned, and morale was low. Many of the mortal defenders had succumbed to waves of madness that had swept across their ranks, caused by the demon Vasicella, who had infected the Astronomicon, the psychic beacon that guided ships through the warp. The siege of the Imperial Palace soon ground on for many days, with the 2 primary attacks during this time being made by Angron and his World Eaters supported by demon engines in one sector, and the Legio Mortis in the other. Major breaches were made at the Mercury and Exultant wall zones, and the way to the Sanctum Imperialis was now clear. The Loyalist defenders seemed doomed, with many seeing the battle now as a suicidal final stand rather than one in which they could emerge victorious.
Perhaps some defenders went mad with fear. Perhaps the corruption of chaos ran deeper than anyone suspected. Perhaps some were foolish enough to think that they could negotiate with the ultimate enemy. Whatever the reason, one last vile treachery was to take place. Many units of the Imperial army that had pledged loyalty to the Emperor turned blasphemer even as the traitor Space Marines made their drop. It was almost as if it were a prearranged signal. In one of the basest acts of betrayal in humanity's history, they turned their weapons on their brother warriors and cut them down like dogs. Thus, did the LionsGate Spaceport fall to the rebels. As the heretics chanted and howled their mad prayers, the air shimmered, and slavering demons emerged from the warp to spread terror and dismay. Then indeed did it seem to the defenders that they were living in the last days of mankind. Huge, bat-winged bloodthirsters swept triumphantly across weeping skies. Clawed keepers of secrets danced licentiously on piles of corpses. Great unclean ones chuckled as they lumbered through the ruined streets, spreading trails of filth and slime and disease. Enigmatic lords of change perched atop the towers and statues and supervised the coming of chaos to the heart of the world. Mighty ships began the descent from orbit, hoping to overwhelm the defenders by sheer weight of numbers. Unlike the drop pods, these presented fine targets for the weapons of the defenders, and thus did the battle for Earth begin in earnest. Defense lasers blasted many renegade ships from the sky, sending thousands of tons of fused metal death raining down onto the ground below. One giant craft span out of control and crashed into a hab unit, killing 100,000 people. Another was welded to the ground, disgorging its passengers into a lake of bubbling tar and plascrete. The vessel of the warped dogs was vaporized, and that Titan Legion's name passed into history. As quickly as they disembarked, the traitors surged forth from the spaceports to besiege the bastions of the defenders. Their first objective was to silence the defense lasers inflicting such casualties on their comrades. The rebels were met by a wave of Imperial defenders, desperate men who knew that they were giving their lives for their home and their Emperor. In the tightly packed streets around the spaceports, the fighting was close and deadly. Bolters chattered and missile launchers delivered cargoes of death from building to nearby building. Traitor tanks rumbled through the avenues, turrets swiveling to bring weapons to bear on the hastily improvised barricades of their former comrades. Soon, the defenders of Eternity Wall Spaceport had been swept aside by the merciless assault, and the hordes of the Warmaster were in total possession of the space field. More and more intricately wrought dropships descended from orbit. They towered over the landing grounds like nightmare skyscrapers. The dark runes on their sides glowed evilly in the gloom. 100-meter-high doors opened in their kilometer-long sides. From their red depths, titans 10 times the height of a man emerged. They were warped giants. The armor of their carapace fused and molded into new shapes by the power of chaos. Within them were men melded to their machines. Some of the hideous titans had strange and potent weapons. Others were a bizarre hybrid of the organic and the machine. Metal tentacles lashed, spiked tails whipped back and forth. Engines roared like the voices of angry beasts. Banners fluttered. The titans of Stormlords and the Flaming Skulls legions marched forth. At LionsGate Spaceport, the traitors welcomed the towering black war engines of the Cornate host. Minotaurs and trolls and cultists seethed like angry ants around their bases. They struck out across the world, achieving various objectives, but mostly drove directly for the Imperial Palace in a lightning attack.
Despite the dire situation, the Loyalist defenders held on. The Emperor himself had retreated to the Sanctum Imperialis, leaving his custodian guard and the Sisters of Silence to lead the defense. They fought with tenacity and skill, repelling wave after wave of traitor assaults. The custodians proved to be formidable warriors, and the Sisters of Silence wielded their anti-psyker abilities to great effect against the traitors and their demonic allies.
Outside the walls, Imperial forces frantically raced from their bastions to try and relieve the palace. Titan legions boldly cut their way towards the center of the rebel army. The White Scars harried its flanks. No attempt to break the rebel line succeeded. Breaking through that blood-mad horde was a near impossible task. All 4 of the demonic Primarchs inspired their followers to feats of fiendish bravery. For every Chaos Warrior who died, it seemed 2 more stood ready to take his place. In orbit, the Warmaster watched approvingly. If the palace fell and the Emperor died, Loyalist legions across the galaxy would lose heart and the war would be over. Without the psychic shield of the Emperor's power, humanity would swiftly fall prey to chaos. Horus would stand triumphant amid the rubble of humanity's greatest empire. He would become a new and angry god. If he did not win soon, reinforcements would filter in from the corners of the Imperium, and his attack would falter. For the Warmaster, this was the desperate ultimate gamble. Everything was staked on this attack. It had to succeed, and at that moment, it looked as if it might. Day by day, the siege wore on. Casualties rose from the thousands to tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands. Bodies had to be bulldozed from the accessways to the Saturnine Gate by war machines. Chaos Titans blazed at the walls, specially constructed missiles ripping great chunks from the masonry. The Titans of the Fire Wasps answered their fire with volcano cannons. The smell of burning flesh filled the air as the corpses of the dead were incinerated in funeral pyres 100 foot high. Obscene ash parched the throats of the defenders. The World Eaters built a pyramid of scorched skulls, 60 foot high, in Temple Square. By night, the chants of degenerate cultists echoed through the streets, and demons flitted among the ruins of Earth. Slowly, foot by tortuous foot, the defenders were forced back. The great walls of the palace were riddled with hundreds of kilometers of bulkheads and corridor. Within this maze, bitter hand-to-hand fighting ensued, until entire sections of passage were filled with bloated corpses. Feeling progress was too slow, Horus ordered the Titans of the Death's Head Legion to demolish entire sections of the wall. Despite taking tremendous casualties, the great Warlord Titans broke through, and the forces of the Warmaster flooded into the palace grounds. While all this was taking place, Jagahtai Kahn had implemented a change of plan. Rather than throwing away his forces against the near-invincible bulk of the main Chaos Army, he launched a lightning raid against LionsGate Spaceport. This night attack was spearheaded by the shaven-headed warriors of the White Scars, who led the remnants of the 1st Tank Division and elements of the surviving Guard armies against the surprised heretics. Kahn threw a defensive perimeter around the spaceport and held it against all counterattacks. The flow of men and materials towards the palace was halved at a stroke.
The Kahn was determined to make a move and retake the LionsGate spaceport. Rogel Dorn, the Imperial Fist's Primarch and acting commander of the Loyalist forces on Terra, did not try to stop the Khan's plan. Overworked and exhausted, he knew he could not control his brother and believed that the White Scars were the only hope for victory. At the time of the White Scars assault, the situation on Terra was grim. The traitors had already breached the Imperial Palace's outer walls and were making steady progress towards the Emperor's throne room. The Loyalists, on the other hand, were holed up inside the palace, desperately trying to hold off the traitor forces. The odds seemed insurmountable, and many of the Loyalists had resigned themselves to defeat. However, the White Scars and their Primarch remained optimistic, convinced that victory was still within their grasp. The plan to retake the LionsGate spaceport was a risky one. The spaceport was heavily defended by the Death Guard, one of the traitor legions, and their Primarch, Mortarion, had made it his headquarters. The White Scars would have to launch a massive assault against the traitors, using tanks, infantry, and jet bikes to break through their defenses. It was a daunting prospect, but the Kahn was determined to succeed. To prepare for the assault, the Kahn mustered not only the entire White Scars Legion, but also the Terran 1st Armored and the Sky Fortress, the last orbital plate on Terra that until now was being used as an airborne carrier and fire support platform. The plan was to launch a coordinated attack, with different White Scars battlefronts attacking from different directions. Gold Battlefront under Ganzrig Nguyen Khan struck an arrowhead across the northern sections of the spaceport approaches, while Ebony under Cheen Fai Nguyen Khan attacked the southern flank. Jagahtai Kahn himself led Amber Battlefront through the center and directly into the thickest enemy defenses. The White Scars assault was ferocious, with thousands of tanks and infantry pushing towards the spaceport. The Sky Fortress provided fire support from above, raining down devastating firepower on the traitors.
The Great Sky Fortress bore Rogel Dawn and the remnants of the Imperial Fist to the Inner Palace. The loyal old general was determined to stand and die with his Emperor in the final hour. The Sky Fortress raced away from the palace in a desperate attempt to reach Jagahtai Kahn and return him to the palace. It was destroyed by a blaze of fire from the Death's Head Titan legions. Even in death, its commander wrought havoc on the enemy, bringing the crippled vehicle down into the center of the Chaos Horde. It seemed as if a new sun was born on Earth as the plasma reactor exploded, blasting out a crater 3 kilometers across.
However, the fighting was intense, and the Loyalists suffered heavy casualties as they clashed with the Death Guard and their demonic and mutant allies. A war of attrition broke out, with neither side gaining a decisive advantage. As the fighting raged on, the Kahn was able to fight his way into the heart of the spaceport and confront Mortarion himself. The two old enemies exchanged few words before engaging in a final duel. Mortarion had become stronger, having given in to the powers of the warp, while the Kahn had remained true to the Emperor. Despite being brutally beaten down, the Kahn was able to find a weakness in Mortarion's pride, scolding him for being weak and giving in to the powers of the warp. Mortarion flew into a rage, which the Kahn took advantage of to launch a second wave of dizzying attacks that overwhelmed the Primarch. In the end, the Kahn was badly wounded but managed to impale Mortarion on the blade of his scythe, before decapitating him. The Loyalist Primarch was impaled on the blade of Mortarion's scythe, but he simply pulled his body along its length to get face to face with the Death Guard Primarch. In a moment of defiance, the Kahn decapitated Mortarion, who was banished into the warp in a massive explosion similar to that of a vortex weapon. The death of Mortarion was a significant victory for the Imperium. It was not only a major blow to the traitor forces, but also a symbolic triumph for the Loyalists, as the Kahn had slain one of the most powerful and infamous traitor Primarchs. However, the victory came at a great cost. The Kahn was badly wounded in the battle and was left for dead. His body was discovered by Ilya Ravalian and Jagahtai Kahn, who managed to save his life. In the aftermath of the Kahn's seeming death, the White Scars were thrown into a frenzy and prepared to throw their lives away in a final charge against the Death Guard. The sudden tenacity surprised the Death Guard, who without Mortarion to guide them were forced back. Thanks to the efforts of Ilya Ravalian and Shaban Kahn, the White Scars decided to remain at LionsGate Spaceport and secure it for the Loyalists instead of pressing on into certain death. With the death of Mortarion, Typhus became the de facto leader of the Death Guard. He was determined to avenge his fallen Primarch and continued to lead his forces against the Loyalists. However, he faced fierce resistance from the White Scars and the Imperial Army, who were emboldened by their recent victory. The Loyalists fought with renewed vigor and managed to hold off the traitors. But even as the defenders celebrated their hard-won victory, they knew that the battle was far from over. With the death of Mortarion, Typhus became the de facto leader of the Death Guard. He was determined to avenge his fallen Primarch and continued to lead his forces against the Loyalists. The Kahn's intervention gave the Loyalists a much-needed respite and a chance to regroup. Despite the valiant efforts of the Loyalist defenders, the traitors had managed to breach the LionsGate spaceport and pour into the inner palace, overwhelming everything in their path. Even the Bab Bastion, Dawn's command center, had fallen under siege, with the Imperial Fist's Primarch still inside. As the situation grew increasingly dire, the Emperor's psychic shield was stretched to its breaking point, thanks in no small part to the constant immaterial assault by the twisted form of Magnus in the webway. To try and put an end to the Crimson King's machinations, Vulkan was dispatched into the webway to find and kill Magnus before he could succeed. Meanwhile, the traitor forces had devolved into a barbaric horde, murdering all in their path as they surged towards the Sanctum Imperialis. The defenders, vastly outnumbered, mustered on the Delphic battlement before the processional to the Eternity Gate. These were mainly Blood Angels and Imperial army, but other Loyalists such as the Imperial Fists, White Scars, Legio Ignatum, and Mechanicum were also represented. With a vast horde of traitorous darts, Imperial army, beastmen, mutants, diamonds, titans, and other horrors massed on the horizon, the defenders knew that they faced certain death.
Horus knew it was imperative to keep his beachhead secure. The final push on the inner palace had begun. The battle raged across the grounds of the inner gardens. What had once been a vast parkland was swiftly turned into a killing ground. Men used statues for cover and monuments for bunkers. Blood swirled in the waters of the ornamental lakes. Groves of ancient redwoods burned. The smell of the burning mingled with the acrid odors of weapons and engines and death. Red-eyed, snatching sleep when they could, both sides fought a total war. Trenches were hurriedly excavated in the meadows. Snipers killed men as they tried to sip brackish water from the ruined foundations. Both sides fought with unimaginable, naked ferocity. Both sides sensed the end was near. Luckily, this was driven off by the valiant efforts of Sanguinius and the Blood Angels. Wearily, the Primarch marshaled the defenders, rallying the broken, speaking words of comfort to the mortally wounded, fighting with cold, implacable fury when he was called upon to do so. Slowly, though, despite his efforts, the Chaos forces managed to erode the defense. They seemed numberless as the grains of sand on a seashore, and Horus spent their lives carelessly.
Nevertheless, Sanguinius organized a defense, determined to buy precious time for his father, the Emperor. At dawn, the traitors erected the mutilated but still living Loyalist prisoners they had captured, nailing them to banners, crosses, vehicles, or whatever else they could find to try and break the spirit of the defenders. Next, the Daughter of Torment, a Reaver Titan of the traitorous Legio Mordaxis, marched forward. In its power claw was the tortured form of Blood Angel's Captain Idamars, a grim reminder of the traitor's ruthlessness. The Daughter of Torment issued Horus conditions. Any who fled the coming battle would be granted a pardon by Horus, the new Emperor of mankind. Sanguinius responded with a rousing speech to the defenders, stating that he would stand and fight, but all others were free to go where they wished. Inspired or perhaps shamed by the Great Angel, it is believed that no Loyalists took the opportunity to leave. Instead, all present pledged themselves to Sanguinius, determined to stand and fight until the bitter end. As battle erupted, Sanguinius took to the skies, his wings beating a thunderous rhythm as he soared towards the Daughter of Torment. With a mighty swing of his sword, he beheaded the Reaver Titan, sending it crashing to the ground in a shower of sparks and smoke. The defenders, emboldened by their leader's heroism, charged forward, determined to hold the line against the traitor horde. The battle was brutal and bloody, with Loyalist and traitor forces locked in a deadly struggle that seemed to have no end. The defenders fought with every ounce of strength they possessed, knowing that the fate of the Imperium rested on their shoulders. The traitors, however, were equally determined, fueled by their hatred and their desire for revenge against the Emperor and all he stood for. Despite the odds, the defenders held the line. The traitors were pushed back, their ranks thinned by the relentless onslaught of the Loyalists. For a brief moment, it seemed as though victory was within reach. But then, the tide of battle turned. The traitors, bolstered by their demonic allies, launched a ferocious counterattack. The Loyalists fought bravely, but they were outnumbered and outmatched. The battlefield became a bloody and chaotic melee, with Astartes, Imperial army soldiers, diamonds, and beasts fighting for their respective sides. Sanguinius himself led the charge, cutting down traitor after traitor with his immense sword. His wings blazed with holy fire, and his eyes burned with righteous fury. He was a true angel of death, inspiring his troops to fight on despite the overwhelming odds. But even the Primarch could not withstand the might of the traitor horde forever. He was eventually overwhelmed by sheer numbers, and was forced to retreat to the Eternity Gate with the remaining Loyalists. The traitors pursued them relentlessly, their howls of triumph echoing across the blasted landscape. The defenders fought with all their might, but it was a losing battle. One by one, they fell to the traitors' blades, their blood staining the ground red. The Imperial fists fought bravely alongside their Blood Angels brethren, but they too were eventually overwhelmed. Dorn himself was rumored to have fallen, although the truth of this is uncertain. The Mechanicum and Legio Ignatum did what they could to hold back the traitors' advance, unleashing volleys of plasma and gunfire. The Titans of the Legio Mortis roamed the battlefield, crushing anything in their path. But it was all for naught. The traitors were simply too numerous and too powerful. As the Loyalists retreated towards the Eternity Gate, they were beset on all sides by traitors. They fought desperately, using every trick and tactic they knew to stay alive. The Blood Angels unleashed their fury, tearing apart traitor Astartes with their bare hands. The Imperial army soldiers fired their last guns relentlessly, mowing down wave after wave of traitors. But still the enemy came on, their blades dripping with blood and their eyes glowing with unholy power. Finally, the Loyalists reached the Eternity Gate. It was their last hope, their final refuge. They fought tooth and nail to hold back the traitors, but it was clear that they could not hold out forever. The traitors were pushing closer and closer, their demonic allies shrieking and gibbering in triumph. The battle was brutal and unforgiving. The traitors, bolstered by their demonic allies, launched a ferocious counterattack. The Loyalists held the line for a brief moment, pushing back the traitors and thinning their ranks with their relentless onslaught. But then, the tide of battle turned. The traitors, fueled by their hatred and their demonic allies, launched a final, desperate assault. In the midst of this carnage, Sanguinius stood tall, leading his warriors with a ferocity that left the traitors stunned. He cut down traitors wherever they appeared, his sword flashing in the dim light of the battle. But then, he was assailed by the bloodthirster Kahn, the same creature he had fought at Cygnus. Despite being weakened from his fight with Kahn, Sanguinius stood his ground and fought on. Sanguinius was able to break the creature's back with the hilt of his sword, sending the demon back to the earth to be consumed by lesser of his kind. But even as he struck down the bloodthirster, Sanguinius knew that his time was running out. His demonic brother Angron was closing in, and the two would soon face each other in battle. Angron, the Primarch of the World Eaters, was a brutal and savage warrior. He had long ago been implanted with the Butcher's Nails, a device that increased his aggression and made him a more effective killer. But it also drove him mad, and he had become a bloodthirsty monster who reveled in slaughter. As Angron approached, Sanguinius could see the madness in his eyes. He knew that this would be a battle to the death, and that he would need to use all of his skill and strength to prevail. The two Primarchs clashed in a storm of blood and fire. Sanguinius fought with all of his might, but he was weakened from his previous battles. Angron, on the other hand, was fueled by his rage and the power of the Butcher's nails. For a time, the battle was evenly matched. The two warriors traded blows, each one trying to gain the upper hand. But then, Angron landed a devastating blow, impaling Sanguinius on his black blade. Sanguinius felt the sword pierce his flesh, but he did not falter. Instead, he used the opportunity to rip out Angron's Butcher's nails. The device had been implanted in the Primarch's brain, and without it, he was defenseless. Angron's head exploded as the nails were ripped out, and the demon Primarch was banished into the warp. The World Eaters, who had been fighting alongside Angron, lost whatever sanity they had left and began to turn on their own allies. Though they had successfully defended the Eternity Gate, the traitor legions were still advancing on all fronts, and the remaining Loyalist officers found themselves leading desperate, but ultimately futile defenses of the last bastions inside the inner palace. Chaos forces were in a state of complete disarray, and many of the Astartes had broken ranks, but vast demonic legions spilled forth onto Terra's soil. Despite their bravery and resilience, the Loyalists were quickly pushed back.
Eventually, Sanguinius was forced to retreat to within the palace itself, personally holding the ultimate gate against the oncoming horde, while the last of his wounded men was carried through. Just as the giant ceramite gate was about to close, a bloodthirster of Kahn leapt upon him. The demon's huge talons closed around his throat. Sanguinius took to the air. Angel and demon wrestled over the warring armies. Both sides halted for a moment to watch the titanic struggle. It was a conflict such as been rarely seen. Two beings of awesome power wrestled. Sanguinius was weary, near the end of his strength, and the demon gouged great wounds in his flesh. The heretical throng roared its approval as the Primarch was cast to the ground, the impact splintering the granite. For a moment, Primarch lay still, and a groan rose from the blood angels. The demon stood over him and howled in exultation. Then, slowly and painfully, the blood angel rose and seized the creature, raised it high and broke its back across his knee. Then, with a halo of power playing around his head, he tossed its broken carcass back amid its followers. They beat their chests and rent their hair and wailed in dismay as the ultimate gate shut. Those within the palace knew they were cut off. Now they were truly alone. Only a miracle could save them. Now, the final siege began. Through great breaches in the outer walls, more and more armaments and reinforcements were brought to bear. The Warmaster himself prepared to teleport down to the surface and supervise the destruction of his former lord. Then a demon from the warp whispered to him the words that he had dreaded. The Loyalist fleet, under Leman Russ and Lionel Johnson, bearing a fresh army of space wolves and dark angels, was only hours away. It would take days to break humanity's last citadel, even with Horus leading his troops. It seemed that time had run out for the Warmaster, that his gamble had failed. Horus was first among the fallen, with the power of a god and the cunning of a demon. He resolved to try one final desperate gambit. He could still kill the Emperor. He ordered all Comnet communications blocked, so that the defenders would get no word from their rescuers, and then he used his psychic powers to the full, to prevent the Emperor becoming aware of this. Finally, he dropped the shields of his command ship. It was an invitation and a personal challenge that he knew the Emperor could not resist. He was being offered a chance, finally, to smite the foe who had harried him for so long. The Emperor rose to the challenge, and he and his surviving Primarchs teleported aboard the Warmaster's battle barge.
The Battle of Terra saw the direct clash between the Loyalist and Traitor Primarchs and their forces of Space Marines. Jagahtai Kahn eliminates Mortarion. Sanguinius eliminates Angron. The Emperor, along with his loyal Primarchs, Rogal Dorn and Sanguinius, and the captain of his Custodes Adeptus, teleports to the Warmaster's battleship, the Vengeful Spirit, boards the battle barge for the final confrontation with Horus.